It writes
Eshar drove the iron
itself.
key into the tablet, and the glyphs flared, forcing a villager to his knees under the rain. Suspicion tightened the narrator's hands around the camera as he stepped forward. He did not yet know whether the compulsion he witnessed was a superstition kept alive by fear, or a mechanical authority enforcing obedience. The villager's bare feet sank into sodden ash. The stones inside Oakley glowed pale amber. The problem stood clear inside those first breaths.
This is the last
The
enforcement.
covenant compelled bodies to obey when its gods were gone. The narrator watched the ritual unfold without intervening. He kept his distance and counted the motions. He had arrived at the collapsed settlement weeks earlier to map surviving rites and record the last custodians. He carried a leather-bound grimoire strapped to his pack and a brass medallion that caught rain in its hollow. He was 48, hair pulled back into a low knot. His spectacles had a smear of dust along the rim. He had spent years cataloging procedural clauses in dead languages. His job now was concrete. Determine whether the covenant was law, prayer, or something else. Eshar kept the iron staff planted in the cracked days. He tapped the heavy iron key against the staff with slow rhythm, each tap a counted insistence. The villager's chest rose and fell in a forced rhythm. The narrator moved closer and smelled cold incense and iron. He spoke once, low and direct. "High Priest Eshar, do not interfere." Eshar answered, his voice rasping. He did not look away. The narrator stepped into the ring of scorched earth. Footsteps slapped on wet stone. He reached for his camera and began photographing the tablet's glyph bands. He flicked a flash only when the glyphs paused between pulses, then stopped himself. The tablet's light rebounded from the lens and seemed to answer. Eshar's jaw tightened. The narrator's suspicion shifted to a different tone, curiosity. He needed the codex inside the archive. He had heard there were clauses that read like lists of obligations rather than invocations. After the final bell of that night, when the villager was left with his knees imprinted in ash and the tablet's glow receded to faint hairline luminescence, the narrator approached Eshar for scrutiny. Rain slid from Eshar's robe in narrow trails. They stood near the tablet's base. The narrator unlatched his notebook and wrote lines in small, precise letters. "Why continue?" The narrator asked, "Why force him when no God answers?" Eshar's fingers closed around the iron key and the rings on his digits tugged at worn skin. "Because the covenant will take its due if we stop, Eshar. It is not mercy that binds us. It is order." He tapped the iron key against the staff. "If I do not perform it, the clauses will call for a reckoning. People will die." His voice tightened into something like pleading and command at once. The narrator watched Eshar's hands. The priest's fingers bore ritual scars. The narrator felt doubt edge into his curiosity. He had to know whether Eshar believed the covenant or obeyed an imposed compulsion. He needed evidence beyond a man's fear. They moved away from the courtyard and under an arch toward the collapsed archive. Inside, shelves sagged with sand and rotted bindings. The narrator pried open a worm-eaten codex on a stone table and read aloud the clause headings so Eshar could hear. The clauses listed measures, times of day, permutations of salts, names of witnesses required to activate particular bans. They read like municipal regulations. "When the third moon is slivered, the witness shall present iron, and the named shall stand under the mark." The narrator's tone sharpened into analytic disbelief. "These are instructions," the narrator said. "They are not hymns." Eshar leaned over the codex. Breathing the codex smoled into his nostrils. "They are obligations," Eshar replied, "and obligations are law." His voice carried the cadence of someone quoting a ledger rather than a sermon. The narrator turned a brittle page and traced a procedural line with his finger. The ink crumbled, but the letters remained legible in enough places. He photographed each clause. The tablet's glyphs pulsed faintly as he worked. He felt the first true shift, curiosity yielding to unease. The codex described penalties in dry, numbered clauses. Line after line described exact compensations, exact timings, exact materials. It read like a civic docket that had been recast in ceremonial language. An outside event snapped them both upright. A half-buried seal beside the tablet shuddered, and a grain of sand shifted across a page. The narrator looked up. The tablet's oculi flared brighter. The codex margin filled with fresh ink in a neat hand, words appearing without anyone touching the quill. The narrator reached for his camera and then froze. He felt a change in authority in the room, an unexpected enforcement. Eshar, the narrator said, voice low, did you? He did not finish. Eshar's gaze was fixed on the tablet. The priest's tapping ceased. The narrator's doubt hardened into fear. They stepped into the archive entrance, where daylight slashed through a hole in the ceiling. The tablet's glyphs hummed in measured intervals. The narrator lifted the codex toward the light. Fresh lines extended across the paper and then folded away as if a type had stamped them. A clause rewrote itself, altering a name, scheduling a task at a different hour. The stone had altered the written record. Eshar's hand brushed the iron key in reflex. He did not tell the narrator what had happened. The narrator saw the priest's knuckles blanch around the leather thong. His suspicion shifted again, this time toward resolve. If the tablet could alter records, then the covenant possessed agency independent of any human will. It changes paper, the narrator said. It changes records. He rounded on Eshar. Who else knows this? Eshar looked away and swallowed. Only those who keep it. Eshar, only the custodians. He tapped the key once against his palm. The narrator moved toward the cracked dais before the altar. The iron key lay there with its edges nicked and dark. He reached for it. Eshar stepped forward and grabbed his wrist. They collided with the creak of rope and the hollow slap of cloth on stone. The narrator tried to pull his hand back. Eshar tightened his grip, and they spoke in rapid, clipped lines that had the cadence of argument and accusation. The exchange turned sharp. Let go, the narrator said. You will not break what holds us, Eshar. It is not holding you. It is holding people, the narrator said. People owe the covenant their obedience. Eshar, then the covenant is an institution, not a god, the narrator shot back. You will not understand, Eshar snapped. Try me. The narrator replied, tell me the clause that binds a living man to stone. They traded 3 more quick lines, voices rising. Eshar, you will die trying to unseal it, the narrator said. People already die following it. The grip tightened. Eshar's thumb brushed the iron key's loop. The priest's face was gaunt. He tapped the key against the staff once, twice. The tablet vibrated in time. At that instant, the narrator felt the floor shift beneath his assumption of control. The shrine reacted. Iron clamps slithered from the tablet's bronze inlays and snapped into the dais. Glyph bands split open along hairline fractures. A low resonance soaked the air like a bell struck inside stone. The narrator's breath caught. Fear spread through him in tight physical reactions. His hands trembled, his jaw clenched, his heart thudded against his ribs. This was the chapter's small cliffhanger, the moment the covenant enforced its oldest clause and changed the stakes. Eshar's grip surrendered to the tablet. The clamps slid along the priest's forearms and into the stone. He did not scream. His mouth moved in attempts at words that dissolved into the rasp of his throat. The narrator reached for him and could only touch ruined robe as iron fused with flesh. The priest's head tilted and his branded sigil on the temple took on a thin glow. Eshar, the narrator said, voice broken into short pieces. He tried to pull the priest free. He could not. The tablet's voice, deep and like mortar settling, uttered something that was not a sentence but a sequence of tones. The narrator recorded them with his camera and his pen, but the cadence was not for language alone. The iron clamps contracted and the tablet's glyphs pulsed as if tracking the priest's breath. Then, with a mechanical finality, the stone sealed around Eshar's shoulders. The priest's hands clawed for the key and failed. The narrator watched fingers disappear under oxidized bronze and had a precise physical memory. The smell of hot metal on hair, the gritty sound of cloth tearing, the angle of light on Eshar's weathered cheek as it met stone. Eshar's eyes rolled and focused on the narrator for a moment of complete clarity. Finish the record, Eshar managed to whisper, each word a scraped stone. Finish it. He nodded once and then slackened as the clamps ground his shoulders immobile. The tablet's oculi dimmed and the resonance fell silent. The narrator shut his mouth and wrote those last words without commentary. Days later, the narrator returned to the empty altar beneath a blood-red moon to perform the task Eshar had requested. He laid out paper, ink, and bronze seals. He mapped how law had become liturgy. He catalogued the tablets, clauses, and transcribed the amended codex entries the stone had produced. He worked with hands that trembled less than on the first night, and with a mind that had moved from raw fear to careful, methodical resolution. The emotion had shifted, fear to grim purpose. He recorded the events in ledger form, noting times, the sequence of clamps, the exact words that appeared on the codex, the villager's posture, Eshar's final nod. He read aloud as he wrote in order to hear patterns. Clause 9. When a custodian resists, the covenant claims a body. Clause 9 subsumes custodial failure into permanent custody. He tapped the page with a fingertip stained with ink. He checked the leather, bound grimoire for parallels. He found procedural echoes in older city lists where bonds were recorded as obligations to be fulfilled by successors. An unexpected enforcement occurred while he was copying the docket. A small stone fell from the tablet's base and struck the ledger. The ink spattered. The narrator did not look up for a long beat. He wiped the blot with a clean strip of cloth and continued. He knew now that the covenant no longer needed priests to enforce its terms. The stone could alter records and claim bodies. That was a twist that changed everything he believed when he first arrived. He packed the sealed docket into a protective box and left it under the arch where the archive's light collected in slats. He sealed the box with an iron band that matched the tablet's clamps. He wrote a line of notation across the band to mark his ownership. Then he turned to the altar and placed the heavy iron key beside the tablet. He did not attempt to pry it free. He did not recite a prayer. He set the key down near the priest's frozen hand and closed his palm over it for 2 long seconds before releasing it to the stone. The narrator's motion was deliberate and precise. He recorded the choice. He would not break the covenant with force. He would document it and publish its terms for others to study. He hoped that knowledge would allow successors to plan differently. Before leaving the ruined courtyard, the narrator walked once more around the dais. He ran a fingertip along one glyph band and felt a faint vibration under his skin. The tablet remained immobile. Its glyphs no longer pulsed as they had. They lay like an administrative seal. The narrator tightened his coat against the chill and shouldered his pack. Back in his study by lantern light, he placed the sealed docket on the shelf beneath his brass medallion. He drew a careful map connecting clauses to actions, charting the ritual's procedural logic. He wrote the final line of the ledger and pressed the seal into warm wax. He closed the book. Outside, a wind scarred the ruined courtyard and turned over a strip of banner. The torn cloth settled into a spiral that matched one of the tablet's etched bands. The narrator did not watch the banner for long. He had finished what Eshar had asked. He had recorded the moment the covenant took its due and the ways it rewrote paper to sustain itself. The final paragraph of the chapter is a concrete beat. The narrator placed the sealed docket into a field chest, locked it with the iron band, and set the chest beneath the archive's broken lintel. He tapped the iron band with his knuckle, counted the taps aloud, and then walked away with the brass medallion heavy at his sternum. The tablet remained in the altar. The covenant remained in place. The narrator left the site with the record in hand, and the knowledge that ritual inertia had become institutional procedure recorded in ink and stone. He closed the lintel with one measured shove, leaving the chest and the ledger where successors might find them and deciding, in action rather than words, how the story would be carried forward. The narrator snapped the codex cover open and a line of inked glyphs inside the margin burned a thin, copper light. Mara pitched forward from the ladder and hit the stone floor with a wet sound. Suspicion tightened his fingers on the leather binding as he shoved the codex away and reached for the girl. He had seen compulsion manifest before. That memory shaped every movement now. He lifted Mara's head and found her eyes rolled white, her throat making small, involuntary sounds. Joran shoved a handful of dust aside and shouted, "Move! Clear the ISO!" The narrator pushed past and turned the codex face up on the table, watching the margin script pulse in precise beats. He was 48, lean, coat threadbare along the cuffs, spectacles perched and slipping. He kept his brass medallion pressed against his palm, feeling its cold weight. He checked Mara's breathing with the blunt, clinical motion of someone used to ruins and injured people, and he moved like a man who had catalogued danger for years. Suspicion drove him to treat the glyph as a mechanism before he allowed himself a theory. He bent to read the marginalia in the candle light. The marks mapped procedures, step lines, seals, and numbered indents that matched nothing like a prayer. The discovery made the room rearrange into function. The stacks became files, the easels turned into processes to be tested. "Tell me what you saw," Joran demanded, kneeling opposite. Joran's hands were scraped. His sleeves held the pale dust of worm-eaten paper. "Did she touch it?" he asked. He used names for clarity that kept panic from spreading. Mara made a raw sound, and the narrator pressed a damp rag to the girl's chin until her ragged breath slowed. Mara opened her eyes a half-inch and then shut them again. The narrator moved the rag and said, "Mara, I'm going to count to 3, and I need you to blink for me." The girl blinked once. He counted small, precise numbers, not because counting fixed anything, but because it forced control. Joran frowned over the codex. "These runes," he said, "they mirror the tablet bands by the days. The same order of knots, the same numbered strokes." He tapped the edge of the page. He had come across old forms before, but never a procedural match that ran from stone to ink. The narrator's fingers left a faint smear of ink on his fingertips. He turned the page and traced a row of tiny, repeated marks. "If the tablet enforces through pattern," he said, "then the codex carries enforcement in language. It's law in writing." His voice was steady. Suspicion shifted into a narrower thought. Curiosity. A footstep at the archive mouth sent a ripple through everyone. Eshar's silhouette blocked the archway like a falling column. He carried his staff. The iron key hung from his waist and caught the candle flare. The narrator's hand tightened first around the codex and then loosened. He had watched Ishar press iron into stone in the temple courtyard, an act that had made people kneel like wood. And he kept that image at the edge of every move. Ishar stepped into the light and said, "What are you doing with the people's rights?" His voice rasped. Joran answered him with a soft, precise sentence. "We found a rule, book that matches the seal, priest. It moves when read." Eshar's face changed in a way the narrator had seen before. The steadiness calcified into ritual determination. He tapped the iron key against his staff 3 times. "Return it to the dais," he said. "You tamper and you break the covenant's hold." He covenant as if it were a machine with teeth. The narrator felt the room tilt toward confrontation. He held the codex close and said, "It speaks in procedure. We can test its clauses without sacrifice." Escher answered, "You would trade safety for speculation." His jaw drew taut. Joran folded himself forward and placed a hand flat on the table where the codex lay. "We will not break people's living. We will search for its design." He used living to remind Escher of those still subject to the compulsion. Joran and the narrator moved to a nearer alcove. Mara breathed more steadily but kept her hands clamped over her mouth. The narrator knelt and asked, "Mara, tell me what you touched." She looked at him with slow, fogged focus. "The ink hummed," she said, "the words minor and precise. It made my name hollow. It wanted my hands short lines." "Clear." The narrator wrote that down on the margin of his notebook with a steady scratch. He showed the note to Joran. The archivist tapped his chin. "If names anchor the clause, then a living oath bearer might be required to alter it." An idea brightened the narrator's shoulders and then went flat from caution. At night the courtyard air smelled of cold ash and recent rain that pooled in broken flagstones. Villagers clustered at the threshold, faces half lit by braziers. The narrator heard their breathing like a separate instrument. He remembered the night in the temple when Escher had driven iron into the tablet, and a man had dropped to his knees, held in place by an invisible order. That memory kept returning as a test. Every time he considered touching the mechanism, he pictured the man on his knees, obedience made visible. He had recorded the event, taken measurements, and still wondered whether the compulsion had been superstition dressed as authority or a literal enforcement. Eshar stepped forward and drew a line in the dust with his staff. "You will not read those words alone," he said. "Bring the codex to the dais. Bring the key. Let the covenant speak and judge." He did not raise his voice. The narrator kept one hand hovering near the iron key on Eshar's hip, gauging his balance. He slowly, "We need to understand how it works before we hand it rituals that might make it worse." Eshar answered with a brittle laugh. "You who catalogue ruin would place yourself above the covenant." He flicked his thumb so the key flashed. The villagers around the doorway shifted, a collective intake of breath. The narrator felt the group's pressure through the soles of his boots. They moved the codex on a tarp across the stones, the pages breathing dust. Mara rode on the trailing shoulder of a villager, white-lipped, and watched. The narrator and Jorin carried the book between them. The narrator's spectacles reflected candle sparks. He thought in small practical measures. Secure the codex under cloth, limit exposure, test a marginal formula. When they reached the archive entrance, Eshar blocked their path again and said, "No alteration will pass without an oath, bearer present." He tapped the branded sigil on his temple with a forefinger. His gesture was simple. People took that brand to be the sign of lawful authority. The narrator set the codex on the low table by the archive's inner light and began cataloguing the marginalia aloud. He read the sequence step by step. Jorin annotated with a blunt stylus on wax. The script included a clause set apart with an extra stitch of ink and a faded caret. It allowed limited modification when bound by living oath, bearer who swore by named kin and pledged to enforce the new wording, Jorin. Here. It permits change, provided a living bearer places their oath alongside the text. He looked at the narrator and then at Eshar. It recognizes a human anchor. Eshar's mouth tightened. "That clause was never used in my youth," he said. "We always followed the tablet. We did not alter law," his eyes fixed on the codex like a man looking at a wound. The narrator slid a thin brass probe along the circled notation. He thought of how ritual had become habit and how habit had hardened into automatic enforcement. Suspicion had been the first impulse. Curiosity had become method. Now a thin strand of dread braided into resolve. There was no agreement. Eshar insisted on returning the codex to the dais immediately. Jorin argued for a measured binding. "If we can bind a corrective clause, Jorin, we might reroute the compulsion away from punishment and toward protection." He spoke quickly, dropping into the rapid exchange style that surfaced when plans needed speed. "We can reword the procedure to cease enforcement of pain and leave the guard measures intact." Eshar barked. "You will not rewrite sacred forms to suit your experiments." He stepped toward them. The narrator rose and said, "We will not harm the villagers. We will not put them in more danger. Let me attempt a binding in the chamber with witnesses." Eshar's gaze flicked to Mara and then to the crowd. He tapped his staff and the villagers' faces hardened. The narrator and Jorin worked through the night, laying the marginal formula on the table and rehearsing the words with brief, clipped phrases. The narrator spoke. "I will bind the clause to the people's safety." He tested the cadence. Jorin practiced the notations with his thumbs. They used clear speech. They placed the codex between them and followed the notation that called for an oath, bearer to speak a familial pledge and sign with a token. Jorin looked at the narrator and said, "Who will swear?" The narrator felt the brass medallion at his throat and thought of its cool weight. He shook his head. "Not yet. We test the text first." He touched the marginal glyph to see its reaction. Eshar moved like a man trimmed for enforcement. He stepped between the table and the dais and said, "You will not make yourself oath bearers without the people's consent. The covenant accepts living pledges only when the holder performs the rite at the dais." He reached for the iron key. The narrator put a hand flat on the table edge to slow the movement. "You will not seize the codex while we test," he said. "You will let us show the villagers why this matters." Eshar pulled the key out of its thong with a metallic whisper. He turned to the villagers and said, "I will enforce the covenant now if you cannot agree to proper care." The narrator saw the villagers' faces shift toward fear and obedience. Eshar lunged as if to remove the codex by force and Jorin blocked him. The narrator stepped back with his hands raised. then moved forward to place himself between Eshar and the book. Jorin pushed and Eshar shoved back. Their movements were short and fast. Words collided with hands. The iron key clattered on the table. Mara cried out and clutched at the edge of the tarp. The tablet's bands in the courtyard had never thrummed so loud, but a faint resonance rose like a harmonizing string from the stone below, and on the codex the marginal glyphs brightened in time. The narrator heard the glyphs' pulse match the cadence of Eshar's tapping. He realized the tablet reacted not to faith but to action keyed by iron and voice. He moved to seize the key and Jorin lunged at the same instant. Eshar's staff knocked Jorin's elbow and the key skittered free across the table. The narrator grabbed it with a flat hand. The metal was cold and pitted. For a breath, the world narrowed to the contact of iron against his palm and a light that rose from the tablet's mark, reaching like a precise hand. The stone tablet outside flared in a single, concentrated bloom of bronze light. It did not roar or speak as a god might. It activated in exact sequences. The glyphs along its edge pulsed outward. For a second, the narrator felt the compulsion brush his skin. A tug under the sternum, like a finger pressing a hidden notch. He held the iron key between his fingers and its weight told him the choice was simple and immediate. Eshar lunged for him and Mara screamed. The narrator had to decide in a fragment which hand would bind the oath. He could feel a shift inside him. Suspicion had become a razor of fear. Fear split into a precise clarity. He moved his other hand toward the codex to place the marginal clause next to the key. Jorin reached for the codex and Eshar tried to pull the key away. The narrator wrenched his grip and forced the key upward, raising it between himself and the tablet. The tablet's oculi, the incised, pale amber eyes, blinked in sequence and fixed on his raised hand. The light crawled up his forearm through the skin like a thin river of heated metal. The room held, the village breath stopped, and the glyphs echoed a single carved phrase in the margins. In that instant, voices fell into a rapid exchange.
"Drop it!"
"Eshar, no!" "Jorin, don't let it choose you," Mara gasped. The narrator's jaw worked. He looked at Jorin and heard the archivist say, "If you take it, you become the bearer. If you refuse, it will reach for another." The narrator had time for 3 short thoughts. Measure the risk, remember the man who had knelt at the stone, and count the cost to the village. He felt his knuckles blanch. Then he moved. He slammed the iron key against the circled clause in the codex, not to insert it but to place its metal in contact with the written formula. The contact registered like a lock finding its pin. A vibration ran from the codex through the table and into his bones. The tablet outside answered. Its glyphs flared in a pattern that matched the marginal notation. Light tunneled along the carved bands and then shot between the seam of the codex and the stone, and something in the room shifted its agency. The villagers who had been stiffened by dread sagged, and the taut compulsion that had held a few instances of obedience loosened. Eshar staggered and clutched his temple, and a slump of disbelief crossed his face. The key did not vanish, but the pull toward a single chosen bearer changed shape. The tablet's amber oculi dimmed to a slow pulse. A tremor ran under the narrator's skin, not violent but invasive. A small, steady pressure at the base of his throat, a sensory tick that made him lift his right hand without planning to. He fought the reflex and held the key. Jorin reached and took the codex with steady hands, and Mara crawled toward them, barefoot and unwilling to let go of the table's cloth. Eshar collapsed against the archway and spat blood. He had been wounded in the scuffle. Villagers gathered around him and muttered in concerned whispers. The narrator crouched and set the key on the table. He realized the enforcement had not stopped entirely, it had rerouted. Instead of a public, punitive snap that seized people like stringed dolls, the covenant now required a living bearer to maintain its terms. The clause accepted a new shape. The narrator felt an immediate, faint obligation flare inside him, an invasive tug that settled beneath the ribs like a low pulse. He coughed to clear his throat and forced himself to breathe in through the nose. Jorin pressed a palm to Eshar's shoulder. "You were always the keeper, Jorin." He spoke with short sentences designed to ground. "You chose to hold the key." The tablet answered you because you claimed it openly. It will answer differently if claimed with different promises. Eshar laughed a cracked, bitter sound. You would play with the people's safety, he said. You would make law into an experiment. He reached for the key, and the narrator moved the codex between them like a shield. Mara sat with both hands on her knees and watched the narrator as if measuring whether he would hurt them. Did it stop? She asked in a small voice. The narrator answered without preface for now, he said. He put the key into his coat pocket and felt its metal cool through the fabric. He had not sworn. He had not spoken any familial oaths. He had not placed his name in the codex. Yet the key had accepted him enough to check the covenant's immediate pattern. The narrator's wrist tingled with a sensation he had not named. He rubbed it with the heel of his palm and felt the faint trace of an obligation like an old press mark on skin. They made a quick tolly. Mara would recuperate. Ashar required a healer, and some among the villagers wanted the old order back. Joran insisted on copying the marginal clause into a sealed ledger and on reconstructing the notch sequence from the tablet's carved bands. We must map every instance where text and iron meet. We must know the triggers. The narrator nodded and felt a shift toward resolve. Suspicion had led to curiosity. Curiosity had swung into fear. Fear had informed a clear decision. He would trace the covenant as continuity. Before dawn, the narrator recorded the altered clause in longhand, making careful marks and placing his notes within a folded scrap of oilcloth. He wrote the sequence down with steady strokes and sealed it with a strip of wax. Then he slid the iron key into his pocket and said nothing. He felt the small tug again, that familiar but unwanted sensation at the base of his throat. He did not speak of it. He recorded it as a physical fact instead. In the weak sun, he closed the codex, feeling its margin warmth cool under the cloth. Joran folded the pages into a crate for transport to the rear stacks. Ishar, supported by 2 villagers, limped from the archive mouth and did not look back. His brand showed like a pale crescent behind his ear. People watched him go and whispered his name. Mara slept on a pallet beside the table while an elder held vigil. The narrator stood under the low roof and rubbed his thumb over the brass medallion, checking its cold weight. He had forced the covenant to reach differently, but that reach had not vanished. It had found a new vector. He pocketed the iron key and slipped the codex into a wrapped crate for Joran to move. The narrator spoke once to the archivist, his voice even. Prepare copies. He said, we must trace where the clauses diverge. Joran's fingers tightened around the crate and he said, I'll begin at once. We'll check the temple registers and the harvest ledgers. The covenant touches everything with procedure. He sounded tired but purposeful. Mara stirred and opened her eyes. She saw the narrator and asked, will it come back? He met her gaze directly and answered, it will, in a different shape. We have altered its aim. That is a risk and a work to follow. He placed the codex wound, side up in the crate. The chapter ended with a physical beat. The narrator slid the iron key deeper into his coat and walked out into the dawn toward the records room with Joran, leaving Eshar behind in the courtyard nursing his wound. He walked with a measured step and felt the small, invasive tug as a new fact in his body. That tug would shape his choices. He had rewrotted a covenant and taken a metal token into his pocket. The decision was concrete and immediate. The narrator did not promise remedy. He had bound a clause to his palm and left the villagers with a changed enforcement. He walked on, the codex cloth scraping his thigh, and each step made the tug under his skin a steady, undeniable presence. Rain hammered the temple courtyard while Escher drove the iron key into the tablet and a metal clamp slid over the cistern, cutting the village's water. Suspicion tightened the narrator's hands around the camera case and pushed him forward. He did not wait to be invited. Villagers shoved and pleaded at the clamp. Someone shouted that the well would run dry by dawn if the seal held. The narrator moved into the courtyard with the practiced gait of a field researcher accustomed to sudden confrontation. He wore his worn scholar's coat over faded ritual vestments, the brass medallion heavy against his chest. He saw Eshar's white hair plastered to the scalp, the branded sigil on the priest's temple shining wet with rain. The narrator's suspicion was specific. He suspected that what bound these people now was not faith but mechanism. That suspicion made him try to map cause and effect, not to plead or preach. Escher, the narrator, stepping between the priest and the cistern, released the clamp. "Show me the seal." The narrator's voice was low. He paced his words as if placing tools on a table. He touched the tablet's flank and felt the glyph's faint heat under his fingertips. Escher did not look surprised. He lifted the iron staff with slow, rehearsed gestures and tapped the key against the tablet's iron rim until the sound matched a measured rhythm. "You do not see it. Escher, you would tear law from the world and let us drown." His thumb rubbed the branded sigil at his temple. His palm smelled of ash and incense. Villagers pressed close with clipped breaths. The village elder shouted, "We will not drink san."
"Free the water!"
He leaned on a cane and spat into the rain. Mara, an acolyte, stumbled forward and then steadied herself with one hand on the altar's stone lip. She had a ladder-esque scrape on her cheek from the Codex episode. The narrator had seen her fall in the archive the night he opened the Codex. He remembered the line of inked glyphs that had burned copper light along the margin. That earlier light had made Mara drop from the ladder with a wet sound. The narrator felt doubt edge in. Perhaps the tablet's enforcement had always been practical, an emergency device to ration scarce water. He remembered the Codex appendix that described automated sanctions tied to civic obligations. He also remembered the way a villager had been forced to his knees under the rain in the last rite. The memory made him press harder for a physical explanation rather than a theological one. "Show us the clause," the village elder demanded, his voice thin but urgent. "If this is law, then show proof. If it is cruelty, we will end it." He named the facts plainly. He tapped his cane against the flagstones. The narrator watched Escher's jaw work. The priest's hands did not tremble. His mannerisms, slow gestures, rhythmic tapping of the key against staff, were ritual as habit and habit as defense. A narrow band of glyphs pulsed on the tablet like a heartbeat. The covenant, objectified as stone and bronze, remained immobile except for those bands and the occasional settling vibration. The narrator traced a pulsing glyph and felt the reverberation travel up his finger to the base of his palm. Mara gasped and folded at the knees. A marginal inscription inside the tablet reacted to the trace and flashed along a band the way a lock's tumblers flash back when aligned. Doubt shifted into fear in the narrator's chest, not fear of gods, but fear of an apparatus that could punish without intention. He thought of the Codex again, a procedural appendix, stamped ink and lists, a ledger of obligations. The narrator's research discipline made him suppress theatrical language. He set the camera on a low tripod and began to narrate to himself in clipped notes. The clamp movement, the glyph sequence, the timed response in the marginal lines. Escher stepped forward and pressed his palm to the tablet where the iron key fit. Sweat ran down his temple. "This keeps us," he said. "You cut it, you release ruin." He spoke as if reciting a law, not pleading. His voice held the rasp of memory and authority. "We already have evidence the covenant acts without correct right." The narrator. He referenced the earlier incident where the village laborer had been forced to kneel under rain when Escher drove the key into the tablet. He the man's name aloud so the villagers would remember him. Thomas was taken when his cart missed its duty to the cistern. The village elder's hands tightened. Voices rose. Mara's breathing changed. The acolyte's pupils contracted. She had seen glyphs react inside the Codex. She helped the narrator when they moved later to the archive. She found the appendix. Now she swallowed and said, "Take the key, let me touch the margin. Show us the clause." Her voice was small, edged with urgency. Escher laughed, a sound without mirth. "You cannot simply unbind what protects us," he said. "The covenant is older than your safety. It answers duty, not devotion." He set the staff into the flagstone and tapped the iron key twice. The tablet answered with a low hum. The narrator felt a shift in the crowd from petition to panic. The narrator and Mara moved to the altar platform beside the tablet, forced by the press of villagers and by their own aim to understand. The narrator's motion was precise. He placed the Codex, its cover still scorched from the earlier scrape, on the altar and opened to the appendix page. Inked glyphs glowed faintly at the edge of the margin. Mara leaned over and traced with a finger. The marginal text was not prayer. It read like procedure. Obligations, thresholds, a sequence of consequences tied to civic resources. An external event snapped through the courtyard. A child pounded at the cistern's lid. The sound halted conversation. People shifted to look. The village elder barked, "Nala, be quiet." A woman pushed through the crowd to pull the child back. The noise was small, but it reminded everyone that the clamp still held. The narrator read aloud in measured tones, saying the codified steps so all could hear. He found the clause that linked water rationing to the ritual keyed by the iron key. It used specific language. When civic levy fails, when well maintenance lapses, the instrument shall enforce proportional sanction. That phrasing read like municipal ordinance. The narrator's mouth barely moved when he said it. He kept his sentences short so the lines would translate cleanly into the record. Mara interrupted. "It says procedural sanction, not mercy. Not will. It is an automatic enforcement." She looked at Ishar and then at the tablet. Her hands trembled. She pushed a damp curl of hair back. Her fear was visible. A tightened throat, clenched jaw, fingers that would not stop brushing the codex's edges. Ishar's face hardened. "We give shape to law," he said. "We carry its measures lest they fall into chaos. You presume to remove a hinge from a building you cannot rebuild." He stepped toward Mara and the narrator. "You would tear the mechanism and let the people suffer because you do not like the design." Dialogue snapped across the square in quick exchanges. "You branded him." The village elder said to Eshar, "You scarred Thomas to remind us why we obey. It was his choice." Eshar answered, "It was recorded." "Recorded by whom?" The elder asked. "By those who keep the lists." Eshar. That back and forth escalated into 3 to 6 rapid lines. The elder accusing, Eshar defending, the narrator insisting on proof. The crowd's voices threaded through the exchange with short, sharp lines.
Release the water! We will not starve! Show the law!
The pattern forced Eshar to show his hand. A glyph band detached and snapped like a spring. It clasped Eshar's staff, searing his palm. He hissed and dropped the staff. The iron key spun and stuck, then locked into the tablet's flank with a metallic click. The ritual clamps tightened. The crowd recoiled. The narrator saw the priest's face go white beneath the tan and the ritual scars. He watched the branded sigil on the right temple flare and then dim. Fear replaced doubt in the narrator's chest. Eshar clung to the dais, his ribs heaving. He tried to pull the staff free and the tablet seized his hand. The covenant removed human agency from that gesture. The narrator, it acts on criteria, not intent. He looked straight at Eshar, where the priest hung between fury and pain. "It does what the codex prescribes, whether you will it or not." Mara stepped forward, and for the first time her voice was steely. "Then we remove the clause," she said. "We cut the paper where the sanction binds." She reached for the codex with both hands. The village elder placed a hand on her shoulder. "Mara," he cautioned, "take care." He had the voice of someone who had supervised village repairs for decades. His concern was practical. The narrator and Mara went to the collapsed archive. They worked quickly, moving by rote through low corridors with their palms against damp stone. The codex's binding had been scorched earlier but still held. They found the appendix again in a cramped alcove where dust lay like old promises. The narrator held the codex under his coat to shelter it from a drip at the roof. He felt the ink's faint, copper sheen under his thumb. An alarm, the clang of a merchant's bell from the outer square, pulled them back toward the temple. Outside, villagers had gathered, more outraged, more desperate. Someone had discovered that the cistern's water level had not dropped in a linear way. It had paused, recovered, then fallen again. They swore that the tablet had lifted a clamp temporarily and then resealed. That observation suggested the covenant could rewrite threshold values. Back on the dais, Eshar lay breathing in shallow bursts. Blood traced his palm where the staff had seared him. The narrator felt a sudden resolve sharpen his motion. He thought, the covenant enforces procedure. If procedure is written, it can be rewritten. He also felt guilt at how previous interventions had produced harm. That guilt he turned into clarity. remove the codex clause or accept that a child would be the next instrument of caution. They attempted to sever the ordinance. The narrator found a leaded knife in the archive, a tool used to cut bindings. Mara steadied the codex while the narrator set the blade at the clause describing sanctions. He made a single incision along the edge where a sewn fold reinforced the margin. The cloth binding resisted and then gave with a thin tearing sound that echoed in the corridor. Eshar moved faster than when he had been imposing rites. He lunged into the corridor, gripped Mara's arm and shoved her away from the codex. "No!" he shouted. "You cannot unmake it with a single strike. You will open the wrong seam." He pushed the narrator backward and spun the staff toward the codex as if to batter it away. The struggle became a series of short, sharp actions. Mara twisted from Eshar's grip to shield the codex with her body. The narrator held the knife against the stitched margin and forced his arm through the priest's shove. They grappled for seconds that felt like measures of trade. 3 thronged attempts, each answered by resistances. The priest's old scars caught the arch of the narrator's sleeve. A mid-chapter reveal snapped into place. As they fought, the codex appendix reacted. Inked glyphs crawled along the cut seam, and a hot flare traced the incision. The cut did not nullify the clause. It translated the instruction into a new configuration. The covenant did not vanish when the paper was severed. It adapted its parameters and reissued enforcement. The narrator staggered backward, knife still in hand, watching the codex's margins glow and then sputter like a small dying ember. The adaptation became the chapter's twist. Removing language did not guarantee removing effect. The covenant had been designed with redundancy. It accepted a new custodian if the prior one failed. The narrator understood then why Eshar had been obsessive. The system would not collapse with a cut. It would reassign custody and persist. Escher seized that opening. He slammed the staff into the archive's arch and raised himself with a sound like someone pulling an oar. "You would have a child own this," he said to Mara and the narrator. "You would hand it to the unready." His voice broke. He cradled his branded temple with one hand. "It is not only policy. It is survival," the narrator answered. "But then prove its survival requires this harm. Show the ledger where an alternative is recorded." The words crisp, testing Eshar. The village elder, who had come with 2 others, watched like a magistrate waiting for records. Eshar could not show the ledger. There was only the codex appendix and the tablet itself. He had relied on ritual competence, habit, and the covenant's procedural muscle. He lunged to reclaim the iron key from the tablet's flank, now fused and smoking where the glyphs had clamped the staff. The tablet, as if reading intent, snapped the glyph band across Eshar's wrist and pinned his hand to the staff. He screamed and the staff went rigid in his grasp. The covenant's verdict arrived in a single concentric pulse of light. Glyph bands formed a ring and rotated. The tablet accepted the severed codex seam as an updated instruction set. The clamp on the cistern eased and then locked again. Water returned in a shallow surge as if the instrument had exercised mercy by measured restoration. But its mechanism had also rerotted custodianship. The tablet pulsed and the iron key expelled from its iron throat with a sound like metal on stone. The key fell and struck the dais. Silence held only for heartbeats, then a child knelt and reached for the key. The child had been placed there by other villagers who wanted the covenant's power removed from Eshar and given to someone who had no history with the procedures. The narrator saw small hands close over the key. The tablet's glyphs reformed into a new seal that accepted the child's grip. Eshar watched the child and howled. He spat blood and accused the narrator with ragged breath. "You made this," he said. "You forced the machine to choose a new face. It will bend the child's life to ledger and sanction." His words were a plea, a command, and an accusation at once. Mara stood beside the narrator. She placed one hand on the child's shoulder and the other on the codex, still warm. "This is not what I wanted," she said. "But it will show us whether the covenant is an instrument for civic care or an instrument of oppression." She it with short, concrete sentences. She did not preach, she acted. The village elder stepped forward and put his cane into the child's small hand, steadying the new custodian. "We will teach the child to read the thresholds," he said. "We will bind the instrument to people who know the ledgers and the repairs." His voice was pragmatic. He had spent his life arranging rosters and making sure systems were fixed. An unexpected reveal followed. The Codex Appendix contained not only sanctions, but also precise maintenance rituals with named watchkeepers and rotations that matched the village census taken decades earlier. The narrator read those lines aloud so the crowd could hear the names of past custodians who had been rotated and replaced long before Escher had branded anyone. The Covenant, he said, had always worked as civic machinery, yet machinery without oversight could become tyranny. The crowd argued. Voices rose into short bursts of accusation and rebuttal. "You kept the lists secret," a woman said to Escher. "You claimed only priests could read. You taught us to fear the seal," the elder added. "You made obedience the default." Escher's responses were rapid but thin. "No, only when needed. I learned it from my father." The exchange was messy and human. The tablet's behavior settled into an immediate aftermath that rewrote everyday life. The key, now in the child's hand, did not glow with majesty. It thudded with weight. Water returned to the cistern in measured pulses. Villagers moved to collect buckets. Some thanked the elder. Some averted their eyes from Escher. The narrator recorded all of it in fast, sharp notes. He documented how the Codex had adapted and how the Covenant had reassigned custodianship. He watched Escher limp away from the days, his robes torn, his hands blackened where the band had scorched him. Escher's authority had not been destroyed, but it had been displaced. The narrator felt a shift, fear to resolve, harden into a new posture. He had entered the courtyard to test cause. He had to leave with testimony and a plan for oversight. He and Mara set the codex on the altar and bound its cover with twine from the archive. They marked the appendix page with a slip of cloth so it could be found and audited. The narrator noted each signature to add a new requirement: Civic Council oversight, a rotation roster, mandated repairs, and public reading of obligations. At dusk, they gathered in the temple square while the child custodian sat on the dais and held the iron key in both hands like a talisman or a tool. The village elder told the crowd how they would check the codex monthly, rotate the custodians, and train watchers. He named 3 villagers who would learn to read the ledger. Mara agreed to instruct them. Escher listened and did not interrupt. He had the look of someone exhausted by both authority and pain. 2 surprising choices by secondary characters changed the direction of the story. The village elder insisted the Covenant's practical features be preserved for safety and taught openly. Mara refused to let the instrument be used in private rite again and demanded public scrutiny. Those choices forced the village to transform a secret enforcement into a communal tool, if the community could keep the checks. The narrator filed his final notes as the last light fell. He recorded the scalded staff, the fused key, the codex's scorched margin, and the names of new custodians to be trained. He captured Escher's brand and the child's small, calloused palm closing over the iron key. He felt satisfaction in evidence recorded and anxiety about what systems do when handed to the uninitiated. The day closed with movements rather than meditations. Villagers hold water. Mara showed 3 watchers how to read threshold lines. The elder walked the perimeter of the cistern and inspected the clamps. Escher, alone, took off his ritual gloves and washed his hands in a bucket of returned water. His fingers trembled as he scrubbed ash from the branded sigil. At twilight, the narrator stood apart and reviewed his footage. He thought of the codex's appendix and of Thomas forced to kneel in the rain in the earlier rite. He noted the change. The Covenant had been a system that enforced by literal mechanism. The village now chose to reassert human agency through scrutiny and rotation. That choice was imperfect. It bound the instrument to human fallibility, but it also removed secrecy from enforcement. A final, soft event closed the chapter with a concrete beat. The child custodian unfurled a small hand and brushed the iron key's teeth with an index finger. The tablet's glyph bands hummed and formed a new seal around the child's wrist. The child's eyes widened at the sensation and then narrowed as the grip settled. Mara placed her palm on the child's shoulder and did not speak. The narrator recorded the moment in a single steady shot. The village's immediate crisis eased. Water flowed, clamps quieted, and a rotation system began. The covenant remained, its terms persisted. But the covenant's agency had shifted from a single, ritual-bound priest to a community that would now, by choice and design, carry the ledger. That outcome resolved the chapter's conflict. The instrument's autonomy had been proven, corrected, and redirected. The narrator left the temple courtyard under a sky still mottled by storm. He carried the codex wrapped in twine, the camera on his shoulder, and a list of signatures from the villagers who had agreed to oversight. He had come seeking proof. He had found the covenant as procedural independence and witnessed its capacity both to harm and to serve. The evidence would change how outsiders understood the tablet. Not as a god but as a juridical mechanism with runaway redundancies. He made his last note on the steps as the child sat with the iron key. He wrote the child's name down and a short instruction. Instruct the new custodian, schedule monthly audits, publish the ledger, teach repair skills. He closed the notebook and, before he left, he spoke one sentence to himself so his field record would have context. Ritual inertia adapts when people change oversight, he said, stating the finding plainly. Eshar did not follow him out. The priest remained behind to watch the child take the key and to collect the physical evidence of his own failure and the system's stubbornness. He sat on the dais and cradled the scorched staff in both hands. His mannerisms had shifted from ritual rhythm to the slow mechanics of someone reconsidering a life's work. The narrator knew Eshar's arc had closed here. He would remain a guardian of memory rather than the keep of enforced law. The final image the narrator recorded before leaving was concrete and decisive. The child clasped the iron key with both hands. His knuckles were pale from the grip, his eyes fixed on the tablet. One glyph band settled like an iron bracelet across his wrist. That action replaced one custodian with another and left the covenant intact but altered by human decision. The narrator shut his camera, placed the codex under his coat, and stepped into the rain as villagers began the work of making the covenant legible to all. He would publish the record, annotate the codex appendix, and recommend a protocol of transparency and maintenance. He did not promise salvation. He promised documents and named responsibilities. The last line he recorded in his field book was not elegy but instruction. Bind the law to eyes and hands, not to a single scarred brow. Then he closed the book and walked away while rain washed the dais clean of ash and blood. The chapter ends with a concrete act. The child raised the fused key, and the tablet's glyphs accepted the child as custodian.